Hello everyone, my name is Cyril G. Villacote and I am the 8th reporter of the 6th group. My topic is about deep water sand models. So let's talk about deep water sands. Deep water sands are those that are deposited below the mudline, normally but not invariably below the continental margin at 200 meters. So we have here deep sea sediment. Deep sea sediments cover about two-thirds of the Earth's surface, but vary considerably in thickness and facies from the continental margins to the deep ocean basins. There is no consensus on the minimum water depth required for the sediment to be called deep, but for practical purposes, a deep of 5 meter on the upper continental slope is probably a good upper limit. This excludes the sediments with the shallow water affinities on the uppermost slope that may be deposited during the sea level low stands or shed from the carbonate platforms and the reef slopes during the high stands. So sand deposition by turbidity, basically currents, and other gravity processes is normal with minimal reworking of traction currents except for relatively low velocity geostrophic ones. Deep water sands occur principally on the marine basins but also in the large freshwater basins. So to continue, the diagenesis of the sea sediments depends very much on the reactivity of the sediment constituents. Sediments rich in organic matter and volcanic components may undergo rapid diagenetic change even during the shallow burial and only shortly after the deposition or while still exposed to the bottom water on the ocean floor. Sediments lacking organic matter such as brown abyssal clay may not react diagenetically for a long period of times. So, geomorphologically speaking, deposition occurs in the channel, cuts into the slope, and on the fan-shaped lobes of the foot of the slope. Speaking of these deep sea sediments, there are actually two sedimentary models that are different from each other, which is the reason why we are going to discuss in this lesson, discuss them separately. We have the terrigenous deep sea models, or model, and the carbonate deep sea model. We are going to start with the terrigenous deep sea model. So, terrigenous deep sea sand. Terrigenous sediments are those derived from the erosion of rocks on land that is or are derived from the terrestrial environments, consisting of sand, mud, and silt carried by the sea and rivers or carried to the sea by rivers. Their composition is usually related to the source rocks. Deposition of these sediments is largely limited to the continental shelf. Sources of terrigenous sediments include volcano, weathering of rocks, wind-blown dust, grinding of glaciers, and sediment carried by the rivers or icebergs. Terrigenous sediments are responsible for a significant amount of salt in today's ocean. So in this slide, we can see the first figure, which actually contains the physiography of the continental margin of California, plus the bathymetric chart showing the main routes of sediment transport, contours, and fathoms. Also, there is the physiographic unit showing the mutual relationship between the slope channel and the associated submarine leaves in the basin floor. Basically, the seaward propagation of this type of submarine slope produces the following sequence. At the top portion, there is a facies of sands trending to be well sorted, often glauconitic, with a fraction of skeletal sand. These sediments are cross-bedded, cross-laminated, and are often burrowed. This facies is deposited by traction currents on the continental shelf. It passes down generally and abruptly into the second facies composed of varying amounts of two distinct subfacies. One consists of laminated clays and silts, which were deposited out of suspension in the quieter, deeper water in the slope zone. The slope shales are caught in two by varying amounts of second slope subfacies. This are the submarine canyon or valley deposit, where the submarine channel reached the base of the slope. They radiate like the distributary of the Birdfoot Delta. The analogy even extends to the existence of the raised leaves of the channel sides. While the other image actually shows the submarine channels, the upper part is of the Bengal fan, for example, in which you can see it is braided, while the lower part are those that are meandiform, example of which are the Amazon and Indus fans. Take note that ancient indigenous deep-sea sands are commonly found in linear throws, sometimes of rifted origin, sometimes are associated with subduction zones. Those that are with subduction zones are areas that are once termed as geosynclines, while today it is now called the four deep basins. The sedimentary sequence consists of thick formations of interbedded shales and graded beds, often interpreted as turbidites. These facies are often been termed as flysch, which I believe has been discussed by the previous reporters. This figure shows a graded gray wacky turbidite sands and shales in the Aberystwyth grits during the Silurian. These sands are attributed to deposition by grain flow, slumping and sliding down the valleys, approaching the state of the true water-saturated turbid flow. This sometimes are referred to as the flux-turbidites. This facies passes downward into the true turbidite deposit of the submarine fan at the feet of the channels. This transition is shown by the decline of the grain size in the bed thickness and by an increase in graded bedding and the intervening shale units. Simultaneously, channels become shallower and wider. The sands and shales of the fan facies grade down into the thinner bedded distal turbidites with increasing amount of fine-grained pelagic muds which settle into the basin away from the prograding slope. A characteristic feature of these sediments is that shales may contain deep water trace fossils or nerites, radiolaria, and pelagic forams. The turbidite sands themselves contain glauconite, carbonaceous detritus, and assemblage of abraded shallow water fossils. So you can see in the photo is actually a thin section of a basinal turbidite sandstone showing transported skeletal grains and ooliths. Now let us proceed to the second sand model, which is the carbonate deep water sand model. Most carbonate sediment forms in shallow water, but some of this detritus finally comes to rest in the deep water. These deposits are referred to as allodapic deposits or allodapic limestones. Take note that allodapic limestones are often much coarser than the terrigenous deep sea sands because of early litification, partly due to the beach rock processes and also the organic incrustation. Deep sea carbonates seldom debouch from prograding micrite slope because there is no carbonate along the delta. It is more usual for allodapic limestone carbonates to be shed from a carbonate shelf margin or form a crest of a rising salt dome. Sedimentary processes are similar to the terrigenous and carbonate sands, but it is sometimes surprising to encounter graded oolitic turbidites and allochthonous blocks in the biolithite or in basal settings. In the image, you can see the stratigraphic section of the turbidite slope in association with Quaternary sediments in the Santa Ynez Mountains in California. This sequence reflects the basin-ward prodigation of pelagic muds, slope-based turbidite sand, slope, grain flow sand, and marine shelf sand, and also alluvium. Well, the next image is actually a showcase of the different sedimentary models. We have the slope in letter A. It's actually a prograding delta, while in B, the slope is located in a submarine fault scarp. Deep sea carbonates develop from linear shelf edges of the tectonic or at tectonic origin. Letter C, you have a carbonate slope apron, while in D, the base of slope apron models, which is proposed by Mullins and Cook in 1986. So what are the economic aspects or benefits of deep sea sands? First, deep sea sands are of particular interest as petroleum reservoirs. This is because distal deep sea sands may interfinger with organic rich basinal muds that may serve as a petroleum source beds. Second, petroleum can be trapped in the deep sea sand reservoir in many ways, some structural and some are stratigraphic. Allopadic carbonates also serve as petroleum reservoir. Cretaceous limestones of the North Sea include both pelagic and resedimented chalks. These contain oil fields where the chalk has been domed and fractured over the salt domes. This is a picture of a regional cross-section illustrating the styles of petroleum entrapment in the deep sea sands. The arrows indicate the direction of the petroleum migration. Take note that permeability, in this case, is highly related to fracture distribution, while porosity is related only to facies. The resedimentation have higher porosities than the pelagic ones. So that ends my report. Thank you very much for listening.